The program. We are now live. Thank you very much. Charles Moscowitz here. Um, the number to reach us 508 637 5596. If you'd like to join the conversation, 508 637 5596. And of course, you can send chat as well. I'm doing a little live streaming here to discuss an issue that's very important, both to me personally, but also, I believe, to the world. And that is my basic as advocacy and suggestion that the state of Israel immediately annex what is called the West Bank and Gaza, what has been called in historically and in Israeli circles the lands of Judea and Samaria. I advocate that they do this before President Donald J. Trump takes his oath of office on January 20th, which of course is really less than, 2 months away from now. And that they get it done. They get it done now. They have a ceasefire, of course, on the northern border with Hezbollah, but that they must do this now. This is a unique, historic opportunity for Israel to take the bull by the horns at last and codify what was certainly a military victory in 1967, the Six-Day War, but which will end this ongoing political agenda to tear out from the very heartland of the tiny state of Israel another state that would be hostile to its existence. This would be like, creating a Taliban state out of one of the American states, or an ISIS entity out of one of the American states. To expect Israel to do that politically, militarily, it would be insane. Religiously and spiritually, it would be wrong. Israel must assert sovereignty over that tiny country that was recognized by the Balfour Declaration, was recognized as part of the British Mandate of Palestine, at least the western part of it. The eastern part, Transjordan, was basically the Arab part of Palestine. And they have to stop the quibbling and the ongoing and endless arguments and discussions. Get it done. Get it over with. Israel is Israel. Israel today, before I address the political issues, I want to address the spiritual issues, and then I'll go to the practical question. The spiritual issue is simple. The Lord God, King of the universe, blessed be he, spoke to Abram, who became known as Abraham shortly after this message, where he told him to go up and go to the land that I will show you. That land is exactly the parameters of the state of Israel today. That land, Abram did go up, Abraham as such, as the world's first believer in the creator of the universe. And he established a commonwealth there. He fought wars with the Canaanites, the seven nations, and he successfully established the first completely sovereign Israelite commonwealth. That continued through his rule and through that of his son Isaac, and then on to his son Jacob. Of course, we know the story of Joseph and how he ended up in Egypt, and he became the de facto prime minister of Egypt after saving the country from famine. And then Jacob and his sons, dealing with terrible famine in Canaan, went down and had a reunion with Joseph, and they lived in Egypt, where eventually, after Joseph's death, they became slaves. We all know the story. They would then be liberated by the hand of God and his messenger Moses. They would wander through the Sinai for 40 years, where they would receive the Torah at Sinai, at Mount Sinai. They would then conquer the land that God had shown Abraham, that being exactly the parameters of the state of Israel today. The book of Joshua talks of how Joshua crossed the Jordan and defeated the Canaanites at Jericho. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is clear about two things here. Firstly, that 2.5 tribes of the 12 tribes asked to stay behind, to stay on the other side of the Jordan, and yet remain part of the Israelite Confederation, and continue to help with their brother tribes in the conquest of Canaan, which God commanded the Israelites to do. So that tells us that the border of the Holy Land was the Jordan River. The Jordan River today is the exact border between Israel and Jordan, or the Kingdom of Jordan, or Transjordan, which, of course, according to the British Mandate, is Palestine. So you have the border established. The second piece in Deuteronomy that I would note is that when Joseph blessed his sons and his brothers, and God and Moses, I think, or God blessed them, the borders of their tribes were clearly delineated. And those tribes stretched from the Jordan River to the Great Sea, the Yam Soph, which of course is the Mediterranean, and from the north, Dan, to the south, Beersheba. Those are the exact borders of the state of Israel today. The Tel Dan is actually in Metula, which is in the very northern tip of Israel. And of course, Beersheba is a city today. It's one of the oldest and most ancient continually inhabited cities. And it's in Israel today. The only part of the state of Israel today that is outside of these lands that God commanded Joshua to conquer is a stretch of desert that goes from Beersheba south to the Gulf of Eilat. That's called Negev in Hebrew, which is a word for desert. So, in other words, Israel exists in the parameters of that great land. That is a fulfillment of the commands of the Torah. It is the commands of the God of Israel, the God that we believe is the one God. There is no other God before him. Why God chose Israel, I don't know. I mean, that only God knows. But that is the very cornerstone of our faith. And it is very clearly delineated that we are to establish a commonwealth in that land, and we are to observe certain laws that would separate us from all the other nations and make us into a priestly sect. That's the concept of the chosen people. Not to go too deep into that, other than to point out that this concept has been misinterpreted by both Jew and non-Jew historically to mean that the Jews are involved in a command to control other people, to control the world because we're superior. Not so. That's not what it's about. We are not superior to any other human being. All men and women, I may add, according to the book of Genesis, were created in the image of God. We are all equal. We are all children of God and images of God. And it is that element of the book of Genesis that was recognized, thank God, by the founding fathers of the United States Republic. That's what Jefferson pointed out in the Declaration of Independence, issued July 4th, 1776, where he stated, all men are created equal. That's where that came from. It came from the book of Genesis. God said that all men and women are created in the image of God. We all have the same rights under God. We all are born equal. We all die equal. We're all equal. So I just wanted to spell that misconception, one that's been occasionally amplified by people who don't mean us well. But also at that time, the borders, as I said, were clearly delineated between the 12 tribes, and Joshua conquered Canaan. He left some of the Canaanites where they were, which means that in some ways he failed to completely conquer Canaan. And that failure continues, frankly. But on a more practical level, the land of Canaan became somewhat of a diverse region where you had both Israelites, Canaanites, Philistines, and others. So you had an Israeli or an Israelite kingdom, but it wasn't, ethnically pure. It had different ethnicities in it, for better or for worse. And that's, of course, the story of the book of Judges, the book of Kings, the book of Samuel, right up through the book of Chronicles. I'm just getting into a brief history here, okay? The kingdom is united under first Saul and then David. And then it reaches a zenith of power under Solomon, where it becomes a great, powerful empire. Jerusalem is established as the capital. Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, which is actually not commanded in the Torah, but which is in the writings. And then, of course, Saul falls into sin, and he spends so much money on his concubines that he bankrupts the country. 3 years after his death, his son Rehoboam turns out to be worse and not even as intelligent as Solomon. And then the empire divides into two, Judah and Israel, or Judah and Ephraim. The northern kingdom becomes more pagan. They set up idols, mainly because they wanted to stop people from making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, since the two countries are now enemies. And at times, friends, Judah remains Judaic. It remains children of Judah. It adheres to the covenant, with some major lapses and some bad kings like Manasseh. But nevertheless, it retains its consciousness, its identity as the inheritors of the covenant of Sinai, the extra code and all of it, and the worship of God, the rejection of idol worship with all of its evil practices. Eventually, the northern kingdom is taken away by the forces of Nineveh, of Assyria, in the person of Sennacherib, and they are dispersed to, generally according to the prophets, regions in what is today Iran and Azerbaijan. The kingdom of Judah continues, and the kingdom of Judah is more than just the tribe of Judah, of course, because Judah had conquered Benjamin, and you had the disbursement of the tribes of Levi and Simon. Since both of those tribes never received an allotment, they were dispersed among all the tribes. And you have elements of the northern kingdom who had made their way to Jerusalem to worship at the temple and who stayed, and then in exile reuniting with the Judahites who had been eventually sent into exile with the Babylonian conquest in the person of Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. So that happened maybe a century later. Then, of course, after the destruction and the exile, the Judahites, the children of Israel, are commanded to return to their ancestral land once again as clients of Cyrus the Great of Persia, who conquered Babylonia and who is referred to as the Messiah in the book of Ezra. Ezra the scribe and his general Nehemiah lead the children of Israel, or a big portion of them, not all. Many of them stayed in Persia or Babylon, where they set up, by the way, an incredible and learned civilization of Judahites, or what in English we call Jews. and eventually leading to the writing of the Babylonian Talmud many, many centuries later. But Ezra returns to Jerusalem. It's miraculous. He reestablishes the state in Judea or Judah. Judea is just a Roman, Latin, Greek way of saying it. He rebuilds the temple and he reestablishes the Commonwealth under Persian sponsorship. Eventually, Alexander the Great defeats Persia, passes through Judea, recognizes the Judean client state under Greek control. The Greeks, of course, after Alexander's death, his General Ptolemy takes over and rules from Egypt, still recognizing the sovereignty of the Judeans, the semi-sovereignty. And by the way, around that time, Ptolemy, or one of his children, developed the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Torah, and which basically brought Torah principles to much of the world. After Ptolemy eventually has a war with Antiochus of Syria, who victoriously presides, he conquers Judea. A lot of Judeans are beginning to become super secular. They're becoming Greek. They're becoming Hellenic. There's a civil war there between them and the religious Judeans, led by the Hasmonean clan, which is a priestly clan. Eventually, the Hasmoneans defeat not only their fellow Jews who were secularists, but also the Greek state under Antiochus. That's the story of Hanukkah, which is a story of sovereignty. It's a story of nationalism. It's a story of religious assertion, one that should and has inspired all of man ever since. And by the way, the book of Maccabees is codified by Catholics in their Bible, the Vulgate. It's not actually codified in the Tanakh. But nevertheless, we observe Hanukkah. Judah Maccabee, the son of Metzisyahu, establishes sovereignty, complete sovereignty, even though he does send a gift to Rome, because Rome at that point was the major power in the world. After several wars and the martyrdom of his brothers, each of whom had a period of control, eventually Simon, who was the last of the Hasmonean brothers, his son, John Hyrcanus, becomes a powerful ruler of Judea, expands Judea, and then, of course, his son further expands it, that being Alexander Yanai, who was evil. And then when Yanai dies, his wife, Queen Salome, becomes queen for a great period of time. I don't think it was long, maybe 10 years. And after her death, her two sons, unfortunately, fell into a civil war. The Romans used that as an opportunity to back one of the sons and install him as a dictator under Roman auspices. And the general Pompey, Gaius Pompey, entered Jerusalem and entered the temple. And while that ended the sovereignty of Judea, the infrastructure continued. They were punished by the installation of Herod, who was an Idumean and who was a forced convert as such by Hyrcanus, which is seen as a sin in the Talmud. And he was evil, very evil. And he established what you might call the so-called deep state, what President Trump would call, in Judea. And the Herodians under Herod would control all of the institutions. They'd control the high priesthood. I would argue that they were the ones who were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, because they're the ones who advocated it to the Roman dictator, Pontius Pilate, who, by the way, I know that he's portrayed this way somewhat in Christian sources, who I think wanted to soften any attack on Rome later on, as they basically eventually literally took over the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, according to Alexander of Philo Alexander, a Jewish scholar in Egypt, And according to Josephus, who was one of the primary sources as a historian of those times, Pontius Pilate was a very cruel and brutal dictator who probably crucified thousands of people outside the walls of Jerusalem. Eventually, he was so brutal that he was even too much for the Romans, who recalled him after he massacred Samaritans who were going to pray on their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, which is in the heart of Samaria. By the way, the Samaritans, generally, scholars believe that they are descended from a hybrid of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom and the invading Assyrians and other surrounding peoples, and that they continue to practice Judaism, belief in God, and except with some differences. They approached Ezra to ask for a reunion. Ezra refused. Now, for reasons that we don't totally know, but that's what happened. And they're still there. They live around the city of Nablus, which of course is the Greek city of Neapolis, or the Roman city of Neapolis, and goes back to the ancient Hebrew city of Shomrim, or Samaria. And they continue to practice a form of Judaism. They have had a rapprochement with the Israeli chief rabbi, and that is a relationship that ought to continue to be explored. A lot of Palestinians who trace their lineage back many centuries, and that's only a small segment of people who call themselves Palestinian, by the way. I'll get into that in a minute. They trace their ancestry back to the Samaritans, and the Samaritans, ethnically, genetically, are very similar to the ancient Judahites. So, in a sense, in the broad sense, we are brothers with the Samaritans. So, back to the history of Israel. In 70 AD, the temple is destroyed due to a civil war amongst the Judeans, with a cult of zealots who were feared and hated by people like Josephus and by the establishment, basically dividing Judea into factions that defeated each other. So the Romans were able to walk in and pick up the pieces, just like they did under Pompey, and destroy the temple. About maybe 75, 100 years after that, you had another rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where the Judeans achieved sovereignty for, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 years. They were defeated by the Romans under Hadrian. Hadrian used a classic Roman technique, the one that the Jews always feared would happen, one that Rome did to Carthage, which is that he really destroyed Jerusalem and built a temple to his god Apollo on the ruins of the temple. He changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and he changed the name of the country from Judea to Palestina. The reason he did it, according to most historians, was because Palestine was the name derived from the ancient Philistines, the sea people who had settled on the coast and who were the eternal enemies of the ancient Israelites. Goliath, for example, was a Philistine, and the wars between Judah and between Israel and the Philistines are legendary. David had wars with them. Eventually, they were defeated by David, and they disappeared from history at that point. So you had the complete defeat of Judea, and yet they continued on in a weakened state. There was a disbursement of Jews, one that started by the Babylonians but continued and accelerated throughout the Mediterranean. Jews, according to history and archaeology, settled in the Rhine Valley of Germany. They were as far as Ireland. They were traders. They were merchants. They got into business. They were known to be polyglots. In other words, they knew many languages. So they made themselves useful to various courts. There's a big Jewish community in Saranasia, which is today in Libya, Benghazi. They were in Spain. They were everywhere. And yet they continued in Roman Palestine and Byzantine Palestine. And they continued to write the Talmud, or the Palestinian Talmud. And they continued to have communities there. They never left. They continued right up till Herodotus, who was a Byzantine emperor and who was oppressive to the Jews of Aleppo, of Antioch, and and basically at that point the Jews formed an alliance with his enemy, the Parthians. The Parthians came in and defeated him, and for about 20 years, this was just before the Islamic conquest in the 6th century, the Jews again asserted sovereignty in Judea. People don't realize this. It was a difficult one. It was insecure, but it was under Parthian sponsorship, which of course echoes Cyrus the Great. They were able to establish sovereignty for a brief period of time. Herodotus came back in, completely defeated them under the guise of the True Cross, and there was a bloodbath by the Byzantines at that point. About 10, 15, 20 years after that, you had the Islamic conquest, the Battle of Yarmouk, which was fought by Abu Bakr at the Yarmouk River, which is near Lake Tiberias. And the Islamic forces were successful in conquering Palestine. One of the caliphs at that time, I think it was Ali or Omar, he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. He allowed the Jews rights under his control. They did not reassert a sovereignty at all, but the community was able to reestablish itself somewhat. And they formed an alliance with the Muslim authorities. Some have speculated, for example, that the famous Dome of the Rock, which is on the Temple Mount, is actually a synagogue. It is unlike any other mosque in the world. It has writings on the wall which could be viewed in some translations as Jewish, as Hebrew, or as derived from the Torah. And we don't know this, but it is at the site, according to faith, that where Isaac, with Abraham, did the Akedah, and where Melchizedek ruled in Jerusalem. He never died. He went to heaven. One of the few figures in religious history who did so, along with Elijah and along with Jesus, who can make that claim. And so you had Jews in Arab-controlled Palestine at that time, which was not really a separate government. It was ruled by the Umayyad Caliphate, then eventually by the Abbasid Caliphate. This period went maybe for a couple of hundred years. Eventually, you had the Crusades come in. The Jews of Palestine helped the Saracens, which is what the Frankist Crusaders called Arabs, defend Palestine from the invasion by the Christian Crusades. They were allied with the Arabs, and they were slaughtered by the Christians. These are just facts of history. And by the way, with regard to the Crusader kingdom, Israel has learned lessons from why that kingdom eventually failed. The reason that kingdom failed, according to many historians, is that after the Frankish king, I think it was Godfrey, or I don't remember the name, established the kingdom in Jerusalem, the original Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. They invited their wives and children to come in from France, and there was a great celebration. The wives and children decided to go down to the Jordan River to celebrate and to, where Jesus was baptized and all of it. And while they were down there, they were slaughtered by a gang of Saracens. One of them escaped and was able to go back to Jerusalem and talk about what happened. And the reaction to this by the kingdom of Jerusalem, the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, was rather than to go out and fight, they built higher walls. They went behind the walls. They cowered in fear. In many cases, they sent their wives and children back to France, and they kind of hunkered down into a siege. And that was the beginning of the end, because if they weren't willing to get out and fight, they were not going to survive. And eventually they didn't survive. I mean, there were several more crusades, but they were not ultimately successful. And eventually they were defeated on the fields of Hattin by Saladin. Israel does not respond that way. When Israelis are attacked, they don't cower. They may just temporarily for a day to protect their lives, but then they come out and they fight and they defeat and smote the enemies that are trying to wipe them out. The same enemy that successfully defeated the Crusades. So that's a lesson learned. After Salah ad-Din, who was Kurdish, so the Arabs were gone at that point, ethnically, ruled an empire. Eventually they were defeated by the Mongols, who came in and really devastated what was left of Palestine. And at that point, the country, according to historians, really became a kind of a backwater. There was very low population, low industry, low development, low activity there. The Turkish eventually, under the rule of Osman, became the Ottoman Empire. They took over and they ruled the area for 400 years, from 13th century, 14th century, right up till World War I. And they did so with a kind of a loose hand, the Milliyet system, where they had local families, local tribes who were loyal to them, basically serve as landlords and send them tribute, but otherwise were left to their own functions. And of course, one of those tribes, the Husseini family, their son was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was one of the people who started the war against Israel. I write about this in one of my books called The Nazi Connection to Islamic Terrorism. So anyhow, every generation, and I get into this, by the way, in my most recent book, right over my shoulder here, The Anti-Semitic Imagination, I document how in every generation there were Jews who tried to make aliyah, to go to the land that God showed us, to go reestablish our homeland, and that this was uninterrupted in every generation, every decade, from the ancient times till today, and that there were communities there in every generation. The Jews never completely surrendered that land. They never completely gave up in terms of population. Napoleon tried to reestablish Jewish sovereignty there, and he was not successful. But in a way, Napoleon, in around the turn of the 19th century, kind of could be viewed as one of the fathers of modern Zionism. Zionism, again, being a movement that it's both nationalist and religious, that has existed within the Jewish people and their allies in every generation and in every decade and in every year from the ancient times right up till today. After Napoleon, you had wealthy Jews like Montefiore and Edmund de Rothschild later, who became interested in Zionism and who tried to help establish Jewish settlements from European Jews in what was then called South Syria, and did so very successfully. I mean, it's a great history of how they established neighborhoods. Montefiore established that neighborhood right outside Jerusalem. The Khan Yunis, I forget. No, that's an Arab name. I forget the name of it. Harnoff, I think, the one with the windmill. Um, Rothschild, who was one of the few members of the Rothschild banking dynasty that was actually friendly to Israel, he set up the what eventually would become the Jewish National Fund, which purchased land from local owners at fair market value and turned it into this massive Jewish fund that to this day technically owns the title to about 85% of Israel outside the West Bank. And all done, you know, on the marketplace. They continue to proceed. Anyway, so we're up to more modern times. I'm not going to get into that. It's just too much for today. There are many, many books written on how the Zionist movement, people began to make Aliyah. It was an organic movement. Yes, it did not start with Theodor Herzl and the Zionist conference in Basel. It actually started more in Eastern Europe in a big way with the first Aliyah, which was 19th century, and the second Aliyah, which was in the late 19th century, and which was mostly Russian Jews, mostly religious Russian Jews, but also left secular types as well. I get into this in my book. I'm not saying you have to buy the book. You can get it from your library. The Anti-Semitic Imagination, Charles Moscowitz, where I show the different waves of settlers coming in, a lot of them from Russia, some of them from Western Europe, even some from America, and how they really started to develop what you have today, which is this incredible, organic, dynamic society that is established. So that brings me up till now. And by the way, let me give out the number you're welcome to call: 508 637 5596. 508 637 5596. So we're up to modern times. Hi, Paul. Nice to see you on TikTok. By the way, you're welcome to call in, as is anyone else. 508 637 5596. So, again, I've got the history of Israel. The modern history is accessible. We know what happened at the establishment. I've written books on the topic. There are many good books. 1967, Israel successfully conquers all of British Palestine, and that means what's called the West Bank. What actually before 67 was called West Jordan, but which historically is called Judea and Samaria, and religiously certainly is called Judea and Samaria. Oh, I got a warning on TikTok because I said Judea and Samaria. I don't know, whatever. I guess I'm still there. Thanks for the warning, TikTok. I don't know what I said, but just for you who are watching the show on TikTok, let me mention that I could be shut down any second. Looks like I might be suspended, in which case, check out charlesmoskowitz.com and all of the live stream sites that are now carrying the show. Okay? Just a forewarning. I don't know what I said. I'm not going to worry about it. We've got Paul wanting an invite. You're invited, Paul. I am now advocating, especially after the events of October 7th of 2023, where you had a genocidal assault on Israelis attending a rock concert and Israeli villages along the border of Gaza. I am now advocating that Israel annex Gaza and they annex the West Bank in its entirety. And they do it before President Trump takes the oath of office, God willing, on January 20th of next year, which is only about 6 or 7 weeks away. That they do it now. They rip the Band Aid off the arm. No, it's not going to be easy, but they must do it in order to assert sovereignty over that tiny country, that they assert the rights and the privileges of all the citizens of that country, both Jewish and non, both Israeli and Arab and otherwise. And that the only way to do it is to get it done, declare sovereignty. Donald Trump, President Trump, I believe, will recognize that sovereignty once he takes office, but it has to be done first so that he can do that. He can recognize it. And the best time to do it is now, today. Get it done. Declare sovereignty. Okay, so what do I think will happen if Israel does this? I think nothing will happen. They'll just do it. Israel should offer citizenship to Arabs in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. They should offer citizenship. If they get citizenship, then they'll have all the same rights as any and all other Israeli citizens. They'll be free to travel in Israel. They'll be free to live as Israeli citizens. They should have that. All of them should have it. Israel shouldn't be afraid to offer it. Now, what would citizenship entail? Well, let's look at the process of receiving American citizenship as an example. Someone doesn't just get American citizenship. Every year, you might note, and certainly here in my own community of Boston and in other major cities, there are what's called naturalization ceremonies where new citizens take an oath to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. They pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. They take a test to see whether or not they have basic knowledge of American form of government, American culture, and other factors. And they swear a loyalty oath to the United States. It's a process. You don't just get it. It just isn't handed out. And one of the questions that I believe used to be asked, I don't know if it still is, if it isn't, it should be, is whether or not you have loyalty to an enemy of the United States, namely the Communist Party. Have you ever been a communist? And you have to disavow that if you were, or you shouldn't be, obviously. And you have to say, I no longer adhere to foreign alien principles that are anti-American and that are antithetical to American government and way of life. And I totally, wholly, and with all my heart adhere to and accept the American way of life as part of my responsibility as a citizen of the United States. So I would suggest that therefore, only naturally, there has to be that same process in the state of Israel. So if you have Arabs living in Hebron or Nablus or Ramallah or Gaza or anywhere else who want to become Israeli citizens, they would be required to go through a basic process to get to that point. And that should include probably a year of education on Israeli history, on Judaism, on Israeli law and on other factors, then they should be required to take a test, mostly written test. And finally, they should be required to take an oath of loyalty to the Jewish state. And once they fulfill these obligations, and once it is demonstrated that they are not adherent of or affiliated with enemies of Israel, like, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah or any of the other enemies who are openly and avowedly dedicated to destroying Israel, then they should be welcomed as citizens. I just think that's the right thing to do. Now, if they become citizens and they take the oath, and then they obviously will then be expected to be loyal to that oath and continue on as loyal Israelis. If for some reason they behave in a way that contradicts that, then of course that is a violation of that oath, and that's a crime, and they should probably be prosecuted or expelled. Now, as far as Arabs who don't match up to that level, or who don't want citizenship, I would say to them, that's okay, as long as they are peaceful, as long as they don't take up arms, then they shouldn't have to become citizens of any country. And for that reason, I would suggest that the Palestinian Authority should be allowed to continue operating sort of like an American state. It's like Massachusetts operates within the United States, the federal system, or Rhode Island, or Delaware, or any other state. I know that's an inexact comparison, but the Palestinian Authority should be able to continue to um, engage in municipal decisions, infrastructure, roads and bridges, welfare, healthcare, all of the normal things that local sovereign states do. They should not be able to make foreign policy. They should not be able to have military, of course. And they are under overall Israeli law, but they have limited local autonomy. They can elect people if they want to elect Hamas, as evil as that is, as long as they are observing the laws, then fine. I have a feeling they won't. I know that there was experiments after the Six-Day War in 1967 where municipalities elected governments, and some of them became radical and they went to war, in which case they had to be ended. I hope that doesn't happen again, but it might. Either way, as long as they want to be loyal, as long as they want to be peaceful, they should be able to operate local and regional sovereignty. Those who want to continue to fight Israel, those who want to continue to take up arms against Israel, ought to be treated no differently than what Tom Homan, the new head of security and border control in the United States, is talking about doing to radical criminal gangs like the Trente Arva from Venezuela and syndicates, crime syndicates who are illegal aliens coming into the United States. They should be viewed as terrorists. They should be detained. They should be expelled. And if they want to fight with weaponry, they'll have to be killed. And that's something that I think we can assume is going to happen in Israel. They're not going to just put down their arms. They aren't now. And thus, Israel is going to have to continue fighting them until they are defeated. And that war could take a long time. It could take 100 years. It could take 1,000 years. I think that Chaim Weizmann was once asked, the first president of Israel, by a reporter, when do you think there'll be peace between Israel and the Arab countries? And I don't know if he was making a flippant comment, but he said essentially, it's going to take 1,000 years. Well, I hope and pray it doesn't take that long. I hope it doesn't take much time at all. But if you have a subversive element inside your country that's continuing to kill you and fight you, you have a moral obligation and a practical need to stop them, to defeat them. So, if Israel declares sovereignty over its entire country, I assume, unfortunately, that that particular element of the war will continue and will continue over time. And I think Israel should take its time. It doesn't need to go in guns a-blazing. It just needs to control its borders, stop any flow of weaponry to them, and just gradually, carefully, strategically, and surgically take them out one way or the other. So that's my rant for the day. I think Israel needs to get it done. I think it will not affect Israel's position in the world. There may be some wringing of teeth, and the UN, which, of course, every day they condemn Israel. I mean, every agency of the UN, you can have an agency on basket weaving, and somehow they're able to work in a condemnation of Israel. Israel does not need to concern itself with any of that. Israel needs to preserve and protect and defend its own citizens and its own interests, both politically and nationally, as well as spiritually and religiously. And therefore, they have nothing to apologize for, especially after the attack of October 7th. People who were slaughtered that day, over 1,000 Israelis and guests, their blood cries out from the grave for justice. This is doing them justice. This is making sure that their deaths were not in vain, that their deaths led to a positive change. I think that it is taking an evil event and making it into something good. Just like Joseph in the Bible, in the Torah, took an evil event, which was that his brothers threw him into a pit, a snake pit, and left him there to die. Eventually, after a chain of events, he turned it into something good, and he was able to redeem his brothers and forgive them for their horrible, evil sin. I think that in that same way, Israel is right to respond to this evil, which if they don't respond to will happen again. They have a right, a moral obligation, and a practical necessity to respond to it by declaring sovereignty over their tiny country once and for all, and to then let these other issues work themselves out in their own time and on their own terms. Anyway, on that note, I want to thank you this afternoon for joining me. Now that President Trump, thank God, has been reelected, I am assuming that some of the censorship is going to start to fall, and that I'm probably in this next year going to establish a regular live stream that will be consistent. I haven't done that this year, but I'm hoping to do it next year, where I come on at the same time each day and where I open the phone lines and really start to develop a great online experience for myself and all of those who participate, and where we will be able to really, drill down and talk about issues of all sorts. Okay, looks like I have. Oh, nope. You're welcome to come on board on TikTok. I almost got a guest. I'm signing off, but you still have some time here if you'd like to join me. So once again, I want to thank you all for listening. Check out my books. They're available at Amazon Books. Charles Moscowitz. I've written probably about 20 books. They're all there. And God bless all of you. God bless America. God bless Israel. God bless President Trump. Keep him safe and keep his family. I'm very optimistic about the future. I'm very bullish on President Trump's establishment of his cabinet. We need to support all of them. And on that note, I shall say